Well, thank you so much for joining me today talking about sinners. I'd like to start off with having you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Christopher Chambers, and I'm the Associate Director here at the Institute for Black Intellectual Culture and Life.
Well, welcome. And I'm so interested to hear how your thoughts as a researcher of Black identity and cultural productions, I'm so curious to see how you see some of this at play in Sinners.
Sure.
So I want to start off with thinking about what part of Sinners impacted you the most?
Yeah. I think what really struck me about the film was sort of this juxtaposition, and there are several in the film, but the juxtaposition about sort of the supernatural and sort of the evil of that supernatural against the mundane. For me as a race scholar, I think a lot about sort of conversations we have about racism and sort of white supremacy. And one of the things I've always sort of reflected on is how it's banal. It's not the sort of spectacular, right, that really sort of shapes everyday lives in terms of the things that people truly are, afraid of or having to protect themselves against. And in this context, you've got people who are just living their daily lives, trying to figure out how to sort of survive. That come together in this moment to sort of experience some joy and some celebration. And on the outskirts of all that is this horror, right, that is sort of coming for them. And it's sinister in the sense that it doesn't necessarily reveal itself initially, and no one suspects it or sees it coming. But when it comes with a vengeance. And I think in lots of ways, when we think about the kinds of experiences that people of color, Black people particularly, have around dealing with racism in the world in their lives, it's really like that. It's the stuff you don't see coming, but is always there, and that sort of shows up in the context of you just living your everyday life. So I think he handles that juxtaposition really, really well in the film. So it stands up for me.
I really enjoyed this idea of the everyday life of Blackness that is also filled with horrors and things that terrorize us, but then you also have that fantastical element that comes in and interrupts that.
It's almost like the fantastical makes it more visible.
Makes the mundane more invisible.
And it makes the way in which the horrors of everyday life impact us much more visible.
Right, exactly. I'm always fascinated when Black horror does that thing, where the Black people and the characters and the communities have to not only be afraid of the white supremacy, but here comes this otherworldly figure that comes in. It's okay, you got two threats against you. So you're right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And and one you expect and one you don't.
Exactly. And so I know that you do a lot of work in identity and how Black people within their cultural productions express some of these identities. Can you explain a little bit more about your work around that?
Sure. So sociologically, we think about identity as a process, right? So that we make ourselves in the context of things we do, think about, practice in our daily lives. And often these are practices or ideas that are bounded by certain kinds of rules or norms. So, we might say it's appropriate to do this, but it's not appropriate to do that. And then we talk about the ways in which we as individuals are interpreting these things, making use of them or not making use of them. And for me, I think what's always really interesting, particularly when we talk about Blackness, is I think on the one hand, this tendency, and I think it has some utility sort of analytically, to think about Blackness as a thing that is sort of monolithic and sort of capable of being sort of synthesized into one thing. But I think if we got into the real world, people don't experience their Blackness that way. I think that it is, in many respects, very individual. In many respects, it is certainly deconstructed and multiple forms of Blackness. And so, I'm really curious in how that process unfolds for folks in their daily lives, and how the things that we are told about who we are supposed to be are reflected in the way in which people sort of make sense of their own practice. I think for me, what's particularly interesting is the complexity of that process, because I don't think that it is single-handedly taking on everything that we're told, nor is it sort of single-handedly rejecting everything that we're told, but it's some sort of combination of both of those. And I think even in some cases, it's people taking the resources of the culture and saying, I'm going to make this into something different, and use it, in my own sense of self. And so I think when we sort of go out there and start to experience that, we start to notice what are all the various sort of subcultures or things that people are formulating, or even sometimes very individual forms of culture that people are experiencing about how they define and Blackness for themselves. So.
Oh, that's so interesting, because we're thinking about, like, you're going against this whole idea of Blackness as a monolith, that's it's this thing, and how it's very individualized as well as communal,
right?
Because we have different subgroups that engage in making Blackness, constructing it in their own image, and how they are employing, I guess, certain cultural aspects that help them define what is Black to them. So it's very individual in that way. And so I'm curious, do you see this complexity of how we can identify Blackness within centers?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that Kugler sort of shapes different conversations about what people expect Blackness to be and how people respond to that. So, I think in the case of the opening of the film, we're immediately introduced to the setting of the Black church and this idea that, for you to sort of be accepted in this space and within this sort of definition of Blackness, you have to leave that devil music behind, right? And while, he's drawn to this on one level, he's also deeply constrained by it. I mean, it's almost as if his need to play, just can't be contained by that space. I think it's part of what draws him, to sort of perform in the juke joint, even though, Smoke and Stack are like, don't come, don't play here. And he goes anyway, because he just has to do it. I think we even see it in the context of Mary, who very much identifies, as someone who, at least with her Blackness, despite the fact that apparently nobody else does, throughout the film. I think we even see this in the context of sort of the offering, that Remick makes, where he says, I don't like racists, but come with me and we can all be one. And part of what we see in the way in which he represents that, particularly in the scene where, he's pretty much turned everybody who was at the juke joint and they're outside dancing, he's playing Irish music that they're dancing to, not Black music. And so there's a sense that, you can be accepted in this space if you assimilate to these norms. And I think it's kind of juxtaposed with, sort of the offer that, Annie makes, where she says, if we really want to be ourselves, it's really about being connected to the ancestors. And so we have to reject this in order to sort of have that. In fact, she says, if I get bitten, just kill me, because if I get bitten and I turn into a vampire, my soul is trapped here and I don't get to go back, to the people that I feel connected to. So I think we get to see sort of these really interesting examples of what the promise of communal Blackness could look like, and that people are having to wrestle with. I mean, I don't think that anybody in the film is like, yes, please bite me, I really can't wait to be a vampire. But at the same time, I think we see that it is certainly one possibility. And, but I think we're meant on some level to wrestle with that. Though at the end of the film, we see that, and I always get them confused too, whether it's Smoke or Stack, but, he sort of has embraced his identity as a vampire and sees it as, one way perhaps of getting to live the life that he wants, which is to be with Mary, which at that time, he couldn't really do openly.
Right. So I love this idea where, Black people are deciding which pockets do I fit in, and how you're saying Annie's rejecting some of these ideas, I don't identify with the vampirism, so I reject that idea, but I'm more in line with the other spiritual side of Blackness.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's interesting too because she's not. I mean, she has a very deeply spiritual identity, but it's not nestled in the Black church, right? It's nestled in sort of these traditional sort of African-centered practices, that in the movie are sort of formulated around hoodoo, which if you study this, it's sort of an extension of what African sort of spiritual practices were, and so it's a different sort of offering, perhaps of what Blackness can look like, even though for some people it may not be sort of the center of what they think Blackness could be or should look like.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And like, do you see this also in the fandom too? Like, do you think so? I'm pulling from Horror Noir, the documentary, where there was an actor who was talking about like needing to see himself within horror production. Yeah. And I know that a lot of people, I was talking to you about Brandon Collander's work and doing like disidentification in order to see yourself, in order to have something to identify with within the production. So we've done a lot about how Sinners gives us representation around like what identity practices can look like. But do you see something similar happening in the reception? Are Black audience members then ask these same questions around the complexities, like who do you identify with? How Black identities are made complex even in the reception of Sinners?
I'm going to take a sort of around the way answer to the question. One of the things that's always really fascinated me about Black horror, and I will immediately admit I'm a scaredy cat. I don't necessarily love to be scared, but one of the things that always fascinates me about Black horror is the way that it upends traditional tropes of horror, right? So, one aspect of traditional horror is that it talks about the idea of the other as the monster, the other as sort of the reason why the natural world has somehow become undone and it needs to be subdued and, order has to be restored. And invariably, the restoration of the natural order is embodied by a hero, right, who is supposed to be, ideal humanity. So traditionally writ as a, white male character. And Black horror often challenges the idea of who can be the hero, right? And what does heroism look like, in many respects? I think we were talking earlier about my deep fascination with Lovecraft Country. And for me, it was a series that really sort of explored these ideas about, what does, heroism look like when it's not centered in, a traditional sort of, white male knight in shining armor kind of character, and how complex it can be. So, in that show, one of the villains of the story is this, this white woman who is, fighting her own battle to be accepted in this space, and so uses magic to do that, but yet has this very different sort of attitude about her status in that society, right? So she has way more empathy, for Black people than many of the other white characters do, even though she's still a villain, in the story. So all of this is to say, I think that part of what is attractive to people about this are the multiple complex ways in which people get to see the prospect for what it means to be human, and what it means to be a self that may not necessarily fit, certainly within the larger sort of societal narrative of, Black people having to sort of fit in a marginalized box. I mentioned earlier that, when I was in graduate school, my advisor loved to tell stories, or at least sort of loved to think about race in the context of, Black people are victimized and, white people are the villains of the world. And I always just thought that was just a sad and overly simplistic way of thinking about it, because I don't think it really maps onto how people live in the world. I think people are way more complex and way more nuanced. And I think that if we are truly interested in understanding the human condition, we have to be willing to sort of explore that complexity and that nuance. And, as one of my favorite scholars, Jose Munoz says, we have to be willing to get into the messiness of it all. And I think horror gives us an opportunity to do that. This idea that sometimes we get to root for the monsters and sometimes we get to be a hero. I mean, there's really not many other genres that really give us complexity in that way.
Right. Especially Black horror, because like Tenant of Reeve Du was talking about how the healing power within Black horror, and a part of that is being able to empathize with the monsters. Yeah. And I think that that's something so fruitful that I think a lot of Black horror producers and filmmakers and writers are doing, where they're giving us monsters that are more in line and protective of Black cultures and Black aliveness. And I just think that that's something so very, I just love that potential of horror productions to give us that. So to engage in that sort of messiness that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm also curious. So as a horror film, and you mentioned, I assume that you're not a part of the fandom.
I live on the outside.
Okay,
I'm right at the edge.
Okay. Like, so you'll engage sometimes, but you're very selective about the horror productions that you're going to engage with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so being a horror film, what parts were you most terrified by? Like, what parts of Sinners had you on the edge?
That's a great question. I think part of my really complicated relationship to horror has a lot to do with the way that I experience suspense. That moment when you know something's about to happen, or more appropriately, when you think something's about to happen, and how you sort of tense up and brace for that thing to occur. And I think that Coogler sets up so many scenes. And horror is interesting too, because as the audience or as the reader, something that the people on screen do not know. So, as we're watching the scene when Mary says, I'm going to go out and talk to them, in your brain, you're screaming, no, don't do it. And something bad is going to happen. And I think what he does wonderfully in that scene, nothing bad happens while the camera is on them. It's the stuff that happens after the camera leaves the scene. And the only hint of it you get is as Mary's walking away, Remick rises up into the sky to come and get her, but you never see him actually get her, right? And so it's that part of the horror that I think, and there are a couple of scenes where he does that I think is so fascinating, about the way that, because they often say it's the stuff that's in your head that really gets you. I think it's one of the things that made, like, for example, Hitchcock such a great director. He rarely showed you anything horrific on screen, but man, could he build up that suspense so that you were living through such anticipation of what was about to happen that you almost couldn't stand it.
Right. And so that makes me interested. That's very interesting to me, because I'm thinking about horror discourse, and Christina, I believe Pinedo, talks about how horror is a bounded experience. And that's fruitful for a lot of horror fans, because you get to enjoy feeling the fear through this bounded experience. But I don't really think that it is a bounded experience, mainly because of the things that you're talking about, how the audience has to engage with, so in that moment when Remick flies to Mary, or Mary's going out there to meet them, we are no, we understand that that's a bad decision to do, because we understand the history of, we've seen what they have done before. And so in that way, we are engaged and in a way immersed into that horror world. So it doesn't exactly give us a bounded experience.
And I think that's part, I think that storytelling is great on that level in general, because part of it, what makes it powerful are the ways that we infuse ourselves in the story. We are interpreting it through the lens of our own experience. And so we get scared because we can imagine, because we've had to experience, that we, can relate to, in the sense of feeling danger, sensing danger, being worried about something going wrong. And in this case, it's on steroids, right? Because it's a vampire. So you can't just run. You can't just avoid them. And so, the way that it makes us almost sort of, move through the Rolodex of our own experience, our own minds, I think is part of why, what makes it powerful. I think it's part of what makes it something we kind of carry with us.
Right, right. Oh, that's so interesting. And so I have a final question. Sure. And this is like kind of engaging your teacherly senses. Would you ever teach sinners?
Yeah, I actually would. I used to teach a class that looked at sort of various forms of inequality and ended the class talking about resistance, and always did that showing horror and sort of having this conversation about Black horror, and showed horror noir. And the whole point of it was to get students to think about the idea of how these kinds of stories, these kinds of narratives challenge traditional sort of tropes, and how powerful culture can be as a framework for effectively changing discourses, which I think is one of the ways that we change the ways that we think about things. And part of, I think, what I like about Sinners is, and certainly people have said this before, it's a horror movie, but it's in ways it's not really a horror movie. I mean, if we think about the things that traditional horror movies do about, gore and that kind of stuff, it's not that. And there's something very poetic about the sort of cinematography and about the narrative that I think draws you in a very different way, so that when the really scary stuff starts to happen, you're invested, at that point. And so the ability, I think, to really take something away is much more powerful. Yeah.
No, I think that it will be very fruitful for a class discussion around all these concerns around genre, identity, and, the complexity of Black life.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for this conversation, Christopher. I really thoroughly enjoy engaging some of your research and seeing how it shows up and how we can analyze Sinners. So thank you.
Thank you.